prays to Lord Shiva and says, please, what can I do to appease Ganesh? And he is told, just take a simple bowl of rice, but go with humility. It is very important that we clean our homes.
Right.
So that in itself is symbolic of driving away anything that has a link with Alakshmi. Because when you clean the home and drive away Alakshmi, then you invite Lakshmi into your homes.
Hello and welcome to Likhawat. I am Gautam Chaube, your host, and this is a show about the books of Bharat. The book this week is Treasures of Lakshmi, an anthology that explores scriptural, cultural, creative, and folk presence of the deity Lakshmi in India's teeming everyday, through an array of translations, erudite essays, and interpretations. And to discuss this book, we are being joined by an eminent scholar, translator, poet, and the editor of this book, Professor Malashri Lal. Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you.
It's the Diwali season and therefore the spotlight on such a book is obvious. But it's also a deeply researched book and the final book in the Goddess trilogy that you and Namita Gokhale have curated. So tell me, how is this book different from the previous books on Sita and Radha? And what led you to this subject?
The divine feminine expresses herself in many forms in our traditions, and Lakshmi is a very powerful goddess and has links with many of the other divine figures that we know and talk about and write and worship. So this particular book came as the last of the trilogy because Lakshmi also has her links with Sita and with Radha. She was the consort of Vishnu through all his avatars, and this pairing is something that goes on over eons. So although our first book was on Sita and the second on Radha, somehow we felt, let's gather it all together and present the supreme divine feminine figure of Lakshmi. Moreover, there is no one single narrative about Lakshmi. And there is a great deal of secret stories, mysteries. There are folk tales, classical literature, as you just mentioned. So we wanted to put a book together which would combine all of this into a single volume.
Right. The book starts with several scriptural narratives about the deity, Lakshmi. Some of these narratives are about the stories of her origin. The other are hymns from Vedas and Puranas and Upanishads. In what ways do these scriptural narratives add to what is commonly known about the deity already?
Interesting that you should ask the contrast that stands between the scriptural narratives and what is commonly known, because in many homes, the 108 names of Lakshmi are repeated. So obviously she has many connotations other than the very obvious one of being the goddess of wealth. So when you go into the Sahasranama, the 1,000 names, you get even further appellations. So we were intrigued by the many possibilities that Lakshmi suggested, and we wanted to bring them in. So we started doing the research into the scriptural material, of course with the help of very well-known Sanskrit scholars. And the first reference that we find is actually to Shri. Right. And this is in the Satapatha Brahmana, with which our book begins. Right. And then when we get to the Rig Veda, we find the Sri Suktam. Right. The Sri Suktam is a very beautiful set of slokas, but not everybody has access to it. But when one reads into the details of the scriptures and their translations as we have presented in the book, then one realizes that Lakshmi stands for the most liberal idea and definition of wealth, because she stands for abundance, and the abundance would be in food, in generosity, in reaching out to people, in good health, in well-being. So she is the figure of wealth, but in the broadest sense of that word.
Right. But she is also, in one of the hymns that I read, the embodiment of wisdom.
Yes.
Something that we normally associate with Saraswati.
Very true. But Lakshmi, Saraswati and Parvati are all forms of the divine feminine. So there is no contradiction at all. between the goddess of wealth and the goddess of wisdom if one looks into the larger connotations of these terms, which we expect that this book will help our readers to do.
Right. Ma'am, in the Hindu worldview, almost all divine figures are associated with an animal, a flower, a plant, a leaf even. When we look at the representations of Lakshmi, her iconography, she is depicted as either sitting or standing on a bed of lotus, flanked by elephants who are anointing her with water. And generally there is an owl seated near her feet, supposed to be her Vahan. Can you please decode this iconography for us? Because it's very interesting and intriguing.
Indeed, very interesting, because environment and human life are beautifully interlinked in all our traditional stories, not only the ancient stories but even the folklore. And the items you mentioned come out of that. So let's take the lotus at first. The lotus grows out of the water but still stands above it. So in a way it transcends that which is below and rises towards the heavens, and therefore is a beautiful symbol of how, no matter what the circumstances from which the person is growing, the outcome can be very beautiful. And therefore the lotus is a symbol of purity, the lotus is a symbol of creation, and also of beauty and reaching out to people. Now let's take the elephants. You're entirely right that Lakshmi is often figured with two elephants standing behind her and anointing her with water. Now elephants have traditionally been linked to royalty and to the sense of grandeur and procession. So surely Lakshmi deserves that. And the anointment with water again is the element of life comes from water. We can go back to the Samudra Manthan story of how Lakshmi emerged from the ocean. So she's very closely linked with that particular element of water. The owl is a story which comes more from Eastern India.
Right.
And Bengal, which is some of my parental heritage. Lokhi Pacha is a common term, that is Lakshmi's owl. So we found a folk story which talks about how Lakshmi needed a Vahan.
Yes.
So she spread the word around and said, okay, who would like to come and be my Vahan? And then she put a test to say that, okay, on a darkest night, whoever comes to me first will be my Vahan. So of course, in those circumstances, it was only the owl who could make it to her very easily and very fast.
Your book also engages with, and there are quite a few chapters, on Kuber, another figure that we associate with abundance and wealth. In what ways is Kuber different from Lakshmi, and why, if I may ask, does he not command the same veneration that's reserved for Lakshmi?
See, again, this is an anthology. So we were able to contact people who have worked in these particular micro areas that we are discussing here. And we had Ashutosh Garg to write a particular essay which contrasted Kuber and Lakshmi. And what comes out of it is that Kuber is usually figured as a Dwarpal, a person who guards the treasure. He is also in many stories figured as a person who hoards wealth.
Right.
So Kuber's wealth is something that he keeps to himself, whereas Lakshmi's wealth is something that is abundant, plentiful, and generously given to people as boons for being devoted and for being good human beings.
Right.
Now there is again another story which I can repeat to you. That because Kuber was so proud of his wealth, he had to be taught a lesson. So Ganesh visits him and says, all right, I've come here to eat. So Kuber keeps offering him more and more food and more items that he could consume. And Ganesh happily goes through it all till Kuber is actually in a state of destitution and doesn't know what to do. So he prays to Lord Shiva and says, please, what can I do to appease Ganesh? And he is told, just take a simple bowl of rice, but go with humility. So the lesson that we learn here is that material wealth is fine. It's something that we all aspire to and we need up to a point. but it has to be held and treated with a sense of humility and understanding and empathy.
That is something was missing in Kubera.
Yes.
And was abundant in Lakshmi. कुछ chapters इस किताब में अलक्ष्मी के ऊपर भी हैं, and you liken the figure of Alakshmi to a Vedic deity, Nirti, as this counterpoint, malevolent counterpoint to a beneficent goddess. What role does Alakshmi play in our worldview? क्यों ज़रूरी है अलक्ष्मी और उनकी कहानियाँ?
इन दोनों को साथ रखने की ज़रूरत इसलिए है क्योंकि जब लक्ष्मी है तो हमें ये भी मानना चाहिए कि अलक्ष्मी दूर नहीं है. They are opposites. So the figure of Alakshmi is presented to us as being disheveled, dirty, unbecoming to look at, extremely untidy and ill-kempt, poor. So these are the so-called opposites attributes of what we associate with the goddess Lakshmi. But let's remember that in the Samudra Manthan episode, it is Alakshmi who comes out first from the ocean.
And therefore she is the
Jyeshtha.
Right.
She is the elder sister of Lakshmi, and Lakshmi herself never forgets that relationship. So when Alakshmi falls into difficult situations and is abandoned by everybody and left under a tree, the person who goes and sits beside her in compassion and understanding and companionship is actually Lakshmi. So it's very important for us to remember that Alakshmi and Lakshmi coexist, and nothing is permanent in life.
There are quite a few tales about Alakshmi in the book. Can you please take us through some of those?
Yes, there are stories of Alakshmi, and one of the stories is, of course, that she inhabits certain characters and impels them into doing wrong action.
Right.
And then there are lots of stories and practices, particularly in the hills.
Right.
We are told that there are ways in which you drive a Lakshmi away from your home.
Right.
You have to take a broom, sweep her out in a certain way through the courtyard and leading away from the house.
Right.
And that is the way to get rid of a Lakshmi. So during Diwali, it is very important that we clean our homes.
Right.
So that in itself is symbolic of driving away anything that has a link with a Lakshmi. Because when you clean the home and drive away a Lakshmi, then you invite Lakshmi into your homes.
Right. In fact, I remember two very interesting references to Alakshmi in the book. When brothers quarrel, Alakshmi arrives, and when women forsake their duties, Alakshmi arrives.
That's right.
So kind of somebody who ensures that people live in accordance with the dharmic way or the righteous way.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. In a way, Lakshmi shapes Indian consciousness, the Bharatiya Chitta, if I may use that term. And there are also references to Lakshmi in the Buddhist and the Jain tradition. In fact, in the book itself, you have included 2 Jatakas. Interested to know, how is Lakshmi reimagined in these traditions, particularly the Buddhist tradition?
The Jatakas belong to the early period of Buddhism, and therefore several stories overlap about Lakshmi in the Jataka tales. Now, the earliest figures of Lakshmi that we find in the Jatakas is that she brings a kind of a peace,
Right.
and a peace and a beauty into that imagination.
Right.
And these transitions that happened in Buddhism happened in the later developments in the religion, when Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism come in. So then Lakshmi turns into or slides into a figure known as Vasudhara,
Yes.
who then becomes the goddess of wealth. So the early Jataka tales particularly when we have the sisters, again we have the sisters, and they are called Siri and Kalakani.
Right.
And they are the opposite figures that we were just talking about. So Siri affirms that the treatment of people should be generous, respectful, righteous, observance of duty, etc. And Kalakani is the opposite of it all. But with the passage of time and developments in Buddhism, the word Lakshmi disappeared, but the concept remained.
Right. Right. And she becomes Vasudhara.
She becomes Vasudhara, yes.
Right. The chapters in this book, in fact, there's an entire section in this book that looks at Lakshmi's depiction in the folk tales and the folk narratives. And we gather from folklore studies and folk studies that when a scriptural narrative is retold in the folk world in the form of folk songs and vrat kathas, they take on a different form. What discoveries did you make when you explored that whole section on folk tales and folk narratives about Lakshmi?
Yeah. The folk tales are fascinating, and of course because they are so localized, you get a huge variety, and often you get different versions of the same story. So some of my favorite ones come from Orissa and Bengal. In Orissa, and Vidyut Mohanty gave us the lead to this particular story, which is very well known, is about Lakshmi when she leaves the home and goes in search of a true devotee.
It's by Balram Das.
It's by Balram
Lakshmi
Das.
Purana.
That's right.
Balram Das is the 16th century poet who also wrote Bhagavata in Odia.
That's right. Yes. Okay, so you're very well versed in that area. So let me just tell you the folk version that we used in our book also. It's the main story is known, but it takes different shapes depending on which community is narrating it. So the idea I like about this story from Balram Das is that she is also the Chanchal goddess, the wandering goddess. So she has the freedom to walk out of her house and wander around in the village and look for the right devotee. And then she chances upon this very poor hut, and a woman who is from a low caste, who's sitting there in utter devotion to Lakshmi with one flickering lamp. And Lakshmi intuitively and divinely understands that here is my true devotee. So she goes into this hut and spends time with her and asks her, what do you want? And she said, well, what everybody wants is to be healthy, happy, and to have some amount of money to spend. So Lakshmi, of course, grants her boons. And then when she comes back, then her husband and her brother-in-law say that this is not a very good thing that you have done, that you have gone into the home of a person who is not so pure, and it's something that you need to not be too happy about. So Lakshmi says, look, I choose to go to the person who is my true devotee, and if you don't want me to come into the house, it's all right, I will go away. So when Lakshmi leaves her own home, the husband and brother-in-law and her household falls into disrepair and destitution and poverty almost. So the husband and the brother-in-law, Jagannath and Balram, realize that this is a mistake, because Lakshmi is divine power and she is the person who grants boons to those who are genuine, good human beings.
In fact, ma'am, there's a very interesting vrat katha, Bengali vrat katha on Lakshmi.
Yes, Bengal is full of Lakshmi Panchali and Lakshmi vrat kathas. But the one that I was very touched by is the Kojagari Lakshmi Puja story, which appears in many versions. It's about a king who had decided that there will be a weekly market, and that anything that is left unsold in the market, the king will buy and keep for himself, so that none of the merchants go away feeling unhappy about where unsold. So somebody decides to play a trick on the king and places an idol of Alakshmi, to go back to your earlier question, an idol of Alakshmi, which of course nobody buys. The king, keeping to his dharma and his promise, buys this particular idol and brings it into the palace, and the inevitable happens, because when Alakshmi enters the palace, then Lakshmi leaves. And the sad part is that this very generous, bountiful king is reduced to being a pauper. And then Lakshmi realizes, and his wife actually realizes, that something has to be done to rectify the situation, because he's not really guilty, he's just being a very good man and was following his dharma. So the wife decides to hold a Lakshmi puja outside of the palace, and that is what restores the well-being and the position of the king and the palace once again.
I find that really intriguing, क्योंकि बिल्कुल एक ऐसी ही कहानी राजा भोज के बारे में भी है. The only difference being, instead of the statue of Alakshmi, the statue is of Kangal Devta. Since this show is called Likhawat, we cannot not talk about creative writing. In fact, कुछ segments हैं इस किताब में जहाँ आप लक्ष्मी को लेकर जो creative writings हुई, एक बनफूल की कहानी है जिसका जिक्र है. Take us through the creative writings on Lakshmi, and since a lot is already known about the deity, where is the scope for further creativity and invention?
Actually, because so much has been written and talked about in terms of Lakshmi or Sita or Radha, we found in all our books tremendous scope for creative writing, because writers enter spaces which are left vacant by the storytelling that has come down traditionally. In terms of the creative writing section in this particular book, I'm so glad you mentioned Bono Phul, because we came upon in our readings for the original research Lokhir Agumon, and it had not been translated. And that was when we requested Arunav Sinha to take a look at the text and to choose a suitable section and write it up for us in English. And the portion that we have is a very touching story of a servant girl who is brought into a home, and during the day she does all her ordinary activities, but at night there is a kind of a magical transcreation of this little girl who is actually the figure of Lakshmi, and the wife recognizes that.
मैं चाहूँगा कि इस कहानी का कोई हिस्सा आप हमारे दर्शकों के लिए पढ़ें.
ज़रूर. I'll read from the last part of the extract. There she was, the foundling whom Mami called Kuruni, whom she forced to slave all day, doing the dishes and sweeping and swabbing the floors and washing the clothes. At night, Mami was in a pose of genuflection, lowering her head to the floor repeatedly. An odd smile had appeared on the sleeping girl's face, like moonlight on a cloudy night. I watched in silence like an intruder. Strange, so strange. The same woman was a completely different person by day, as though the foundling was a nuisance, as though she would be relieved if the girl left. Do you know the truth? Mami believed in the evil eye. So Mami is the person who realized the Lakshmi in the little girl.
Finally, ma'am, a question about your own Likhawat. Namita Gokhale, you have collaborated on several projects. There is a play on Michael Madhusudan, Dutt, the Goddess trilogy. What is the next book that the two of you are working on?
Well, Namita Gokhale and I have a very long writing partnership. For the last year or so, we've been working on Himalayan folklore, because the lesser known languages have not been represented in the usual kind of material that we find in the market. So we've worked very hard with a large team and gone into the interiors and the small languages of the Himalayas to collect from original sources and have them translated. So that's what's kept us busy. Let's hope a book will emerge out of it.
मैम, आज आप हमारे साथ जुड़ी और लक्ष्मी से जुड़ी इतनी सारी बातें हमें बताई, और इतनी शानदार किताब को आपने क्यूरेट और एडिट किया. आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद.
आपको भी धन्यवाद.
थैंक यू व्यूअर्स. मुझे उम्मीद है आज का एपिसोड आपको पसंद आया होगा, और दिवाली के समय जब हम लक्ष्मी पूजा करेंगे तब इस किताब की याद भी आपको आएगी. मैं चाहूँगा आप ये किताब लें और इसको पढ़ें, और हमारे प्रीवियस एपिसोड्स को देखने के लिए गो टू द लिखावट प्लेलिस्ट ऑन आवर यूट्यूब चैनल एंड डू पोस्ट योर कमेंट्स देयर. आई एम गौतम चौबे, योर होस्ट. यू कीप वॉचिंग सनसेट टीवी. नमस्ते.
watch more programs of Sunset TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.